The word irreplaceable gets thrown around in reality television like it means something permanent, like the network that uses it in a promotional campaign actually believes it. Like the thumbnails and the taglines and the "she is the show" framing that gets applied to a talent represents some kind of contractual promise rather than a marketing decision. Irreplaceable. That word has followed Darcey Silva through this franchise for over a decade, through multiple spin offs, multiple relationships, multiple reinventions, until it stopped being a compliment and became a structural assumption. The kind of assumption that entire content strategies get built on top of. You do not plan around replacing someone irreplaceable. You do not quietly develop a contingency for the person the show supposedly cannot exist without. And then TLC, which has been in the business of replacing irreplaceable people since long before Darcey Silva ever sat down in a confessional, introduced a new cast member to its expanding 90-day universe. And the research community looked at her, and then looked at Darcey, and then looked back. And what they found has been shared nearly 400,000 times. If this kind of deep dive content is what you come here for, the analysis that goes places the mainstream recaps won't, hit like and subscribe right now. The tell-all tapes exist because somebody has to say the things out loud that everyone is already thinking. You being here means you're already that kind of viewer. Welcome. Now, let's get into exactly what 400,000 shares actually means, because this is not a fan theory. This is a documented pattern. And the documentation is what makes it impossible to dismiss. The comparison started the way most significant discoveries in the 90-day research community start, not with a single explosive revelation, but with a nagging feeling shared in a comment section that wouldn't leave people alone. Someone noticed something small. Then, someone else noticed the same small thing independently. Then, a third person pulled receipts. And when the receipts were assembled into a single document and posted, the response wasn't the usual parasocial outrage cycle that burns hot for 48 hours and disappears. It was something quieter and more sustained. People weren't just reacting. They were reading carefully, comparing screenshots, going back to old episodes to verify timestamps. The 400,000 shares happened because the evidence was specific enough to reward that kind of careful attention. And specific evidence, in this industry, is the only kind that actually matters. So what did the researchers actually find? Because this is the part that separates the conversation from speculation and puts it firmly in the territory of pattern recognition. The comparison document identified 11 structural similarities between the new cast member's story, as TLC has constructed it, and Darcey's story as it developed across her early seasons. Not 11 vague thematic overlaps. 11 specific, documented, cross-reference data points that collectively describe not a coincidence, but a blueprint. The first is the emotional archetype, the intensely romantic lead who describes herself as a hopeless romantic, the woman who loves quickly, completely, and visibly, whose relationship with romantic love is the engine of her narrative rather than a background detail. This is not an uncommon human experience, but it is a very specific content archetype, and the way TLC has framed the new cast member's emotional profile in promotional materials echoes the specific language used to introduce Darcey in her earliest 90-day appearances with a precision that goes beyond generic casting. The second is the aesthetic profile. And this one is where the research community's work becomes genuinely difficult to argue with, because aesthetic choices in reality television are not organic. They are production decisions. The styling, the color palette, and the visual presentation are discussed in pre-production meetings, developed in collaboration with the production team, and adjusted based on what the network believes will resonate with its established audience. When a new cast member's aesthetic profile tracks closely to an existing cast member's established visual identity, you are not looking at personal taste. You are looking at a decision made in a production meeting. The third is the relationship structure, the specific geographic and cultural pairing, the particular dynamic between a fiercely emotional American woman and a partner from a specific region of Europe that generates the exact friction, the exact romantic tension, the exact third act crisis that the franchise has learned its audience will watch in its entirety, regardless of how they claim to feel about the people involved. The franchise has a formula. That formula has been stress tested across multiple seasons, and the casting of the new lead is a replication of the formula's most proven variables. The fourth is the procedural narrative, the way the season is structured, the specific story beats that appear in the first season and at what point in the season they appear. Cosmetic journey content, vulnerability content, the particular rhythm of hope and disappointment that the production deploys across a season arc. These are not spontaneous story developments. These are produced decisions. And when a new cast member's season structure mirrors a previous cast member's trajectory precisely, someone in the production made that call. But the fifth element is the one that shifted the research community from analysis to conviction. In a promotional interview, a network-sanctioned, producer-reviewed promotional interview that was approved before it was released, the new cast member used 4 phrases in sequence that are direct echoes of Darcey's most iconic interview language. Not paraphrases, not thematic equivalents, 4 phrases in the same sequence that any longtime viewer of this franchise would immediately recognize as Darcey's specific emotional vocabulary. The research community found this. They time-stamped it. They posted them side by side. And then 400,000 people shared it because they watched it side by side and understood what they were looking at. Either that is the most extraordinary coincidence in the documented history of reality television, or someone handed the new cast member a brief, and the brief said, "Here is how Darcey talks about love. Learn this register, deliver it as your own." Now here is where this story stops being about casting decisions and starts being about something much more uncomfortable. The decade-long dynamic between Darcey Silva and the network that built her into a franchise cornerstone and is now, methodically and quietly, beginning the process of transitioning away from her. Because to understand why this moment is as significant as 400,000 shares suggest it is, you have to understand what Darcey actually gave TLC across that decade. Not in terms of ratings, though the ratings were there. In terms of the specific, costly, professionally and personally risky loyalty that she extended to a network that operates entirely on commercial logic. She stayed when other cast members left, when the edit was unkind, and there were seasons where the edit was genuinely unkind, where the production decisions about how to present her life generated public conversation that would have motivated a less committed talent to walk away or at minimum renegotiate. She stayed. She signed the next contract. She showed up to reunions where showing up required a level of professional composure that most people could not sustain under equivalent public scrutiny. She did the press cycle for the spinoff. She extended the brand into new verticals. She was, in the language the industry actually uses for this, a reliable asset, the kind that generates consistent returns even through turbulent periods that test audience patience. and the specific cruelty of commercial logic. Not malicious cruelty, just structural cruelty. The kind that doesn't require anyone to be a bad person is that none of that loyalty factors into the replacement calculation. The calculation is cost, return, and replacement difficulty. It is not emotional. It does not have a column for a decade of showing up when showing up was costly. When a cheaper, fresher, comparably compelling replacement becomes available, and the metrics indicate that the audience response is directionally positive, the calculation completes itself. And nobody in the network has to feel bad about it because nobody in the network made it personal. It was always commercial. The tragedy is entirely on the side of the person who experienced it as something more. And Darcey is now caught in the double bind that this situation creates for any talent in her position, because the bind is airtight, and it was designed that way, even if the design wasn't intentional. If she acknowledges the comparison publicly, if she addresses what 400,000 shares have made objectively impossible to ignore, she becomes the person who noticed their own replacement and said something about it, which is not a strong negotiating position with any network anywhere. The optics of naming your own replacement are always worse than the reality of being replaced, because naming it confirms it. And confirmation is what the network has been carefully avoiding creating in any official capacity, because official confirmation creates legal and contractual complexity that the unwinding process is specifically structured to sidestep. If she ignores it, if she continues posting content and maintaining her brand as if the comparison document doesn't exist, and the new cast member isn't tracking the specific metrics that a replacement audition generates, then she is either genuinely unaware, which the 400,000 shares make implausible, or she is performing unawareness, which the audience will read as performance. And neither reading positions her as the person in control of this situation. The network created the double bind the moment the casting decision was finalized. Whether the specific intention was to create a no-win situation for Darcey, or simply to replicate a successful formula without regard for what that replication communicated. And frankly, the outcome is the same, regardless of the intention. The result is a trap that cannot be exited cleanly. She can manage the optics. She cannot undo the fundamental position the casting decision put her in. Now, let's talk about the financial mechanics of what happens next, because this is the dimension of the story that most of the mainstream conversation avoids. And avoiding it means missing the part that actually determines outcomes. Being replaced in a franchise is not a single event. It is a gradient. It does not begin with a phone call or a meeting or a formal conversation about the future of the talent relationship. It begins with resource reallocation, small, incremental, deniable at each individual step. Promotional budget shifts. Social media support from network accounts redistributes toward the newer talent. Producer attention during shoots follows the network's actual investment priorities rather than the official ones. Episode allocation, screen time, the particular type of story the production decides to build around you, all adjust before any conversation about contract renewal occurs. The talent is always the last person to be formally told what the metrics and the internal budget conversations have been indicating for months. This is not accidental. It is structural. Telling the talent early creates negotiating leverage for the talent and complicates the timeline the network has already established for the transition. So the formal conversation happens late after the reallocation is substantially complete. after the new talent's first season has generated enough data to justify the decisions that were already being made. After the point at which the outcome of the conversation is essentially predetermined. The metrics in this case are specific, and they are not favorable to Darcey's negotiating position. The new cast members' early engagement numbers are not just views, but the specific engagement signals that networks use to forecast long-term audience investment are tracking above comparable early-stage numbers from Darcey's equivalent seasons. Not dramatically above, measurably above. And in a network's content investment logic, measurably better with a lower cost basis is not the beginning of a conversation about whether to make a transition. It is the beginning of a conversation about how quickly to complete one. There is a specific behavioral pattern that emerges at this stage of a franchise replacement cycle. And once you know what to look for, it becomes one of the most reliable tells in reality television. The incumbent talent, the one whose position is being eroded, begins producing content that has a very particular register. It is aspirational, empowered, focused on personal evolution and elevated self-awareness. The specific content format varies, but the emotional message is consistent. I am not worried. I am not looking. I am too busy becoming the next version of myself to pay attention to whatever the network is doing. This is the Unbothered era content, and it is coming. You can set a timeline for it based on when the comparison documents reach peaked, because management teams monitor these things and respond to them with a specific strategic playbook that has been refined across multiple talent replacement cycles in multiple franchises. The sunglasses, the leveling up caption, the implicit energy of someone who absolutely notices and is performing not noticing with a precision that itself communicates exactly what it is trying to conceal. The audience will divide on it. Half will affirm it yes, rise above it, focus on yourself, don't give them the reaction they want. The other half will clock it as the response it is, and both halves will be correct about different dimensions of the same thing. The unbothered content is the only brand-safe tool available in this position. It is also completely transparent to anyone who has watched Darcey's content evolution long enough to understand that the unbothered register appears during periods when she needs the audience to believe she is unbothered, not during periods when she actually is. The content itself is the tell. It has always been the tell. And the audience that has been paying attention since season 1 knows exactly what it is reading when they see it. But here is where I want to pull back from the immediate drama and say something that I think is more important than the specific casting comparison, more important than the engagement metrics, more important than the management strategy playbook. Because the real story here is not about TLC's cynicism or Darcey's position or even the research community's extraordinary documentation work. The real story is about the agreement. The agreement that every talent who enters a reality television franchise makes. Not the contract, the implicit agreement underneath the contract. The one that says, I will give you my life, my relationships, my difficult moments, my worst days, my most embarrassing vulnerabilities, my most publicly visible failures. I will let you edit them into whatever narrative serves your commercial interests. I will sign the next contract when the previous one has been unkind to me. I will show up when showing up is costly. I will extend loyalty to you across years of a relationship that you experience as commercial and that I inevitably, despite everything I know about this industry, will experience as personal. And in exchange, you will make me visible. You will give me an audience. You will give me the platform and the recognition and the feeling of being seen by millions of people in a way that most humans never experience in their lifetimes. And I will tell myself that this is enough to justify the terms of the transaction. This is not a naive agreement. Darcey has been in this industry long enough to have watched this exact cycle complete itself for multiple cast members before her. She knows what TLC does at the end of a talent's commercial peak. She has watched it happen to people she knows. And she stayed anyway because the validation, the platform, the audience, the feeling that your life and your story and your specific emotional experience of being human matters enough to millions of people that they will watch it every week, those things are worth the terms of the transaction until they aren't. Until the transaction reaches its natural conclusion and the thing that was always going to happen at the end of it arrives. The hypocrisy in this situation does not belong to Darcey. She was honest about what she wanted from the deal. It does not belong to TLC. They were honest in their commercial way about what they were buying. The hypocrisy belongs to the implicit agreement itself, the one where both parties understand that the relationship is temporary and transactional, and yet both parties, for different reasons, behave as if it might be something more. The network behaves as if the talent is a partner right up until the moment the metrics indicate she is a liability. The talent behaves as if the network is a community, right up until the moment the casting announcement proves otherwise. The agreement creates the conditions for betrayal on both sides, not because either party is dishonest, because the agreement was built on a structural misalignment that was always going to produce this exact collision at this exact point. And here is the detail that makes this moment different from the previous difficult moments in Darcey's 90-day arc. The ones she has survived and, arguably, turned into content that was more compelling than the original stable period that preceded the difficulty. This particular challenge does not come from her choices. It does not come from a relationship that went wrong or a decision that she made on camera that the edit then weaponized. It comes from a business decision made in a room she was not in by people applying a commercial logic that has nothing to do with her character, her talent, or the decade of reliable professional conduct she delivered to an institution that was incapable of factoring any of those things into its calculations. That is the specific cruelty of this version of the story. Every other point of no return in Darcey's public narrative has contained within it some dimension of personal agency, some choice she made, some moment where a different decision might have produced a different outcome. This one doesn't. This one is purely structural. And the loneliness of being replaced not because of anything you did or didn't do, but simply because the formula you embodied has been observed closely enough to be replicated at a lower cost, is the particular loneliness that most people in most industries never have to face publicly. Most people face it in an office, quietly, with a severance package and an NDA. Darcey is facing it in a comparison document with 400,000 shares. The 400,000 shares are the point of no return. Not because they expose something TLC was successfully hiding. Anyone inside the industry understood the direction of travel before the document existed, but because they placed the story in the cultural record in a permanent and searchable form. Every subsequent negotiation Darcey has with TLC now happens in the shadow of that document. Every conversation she has with another network includes at least an implicit reference to where things stand with her current one. Every brand partnership discussion, every appearance booking, every collaboration inquiry, all of it is now filtered through the lens of a talent who may be in transition. And transition in this industry has a very specific effect on the willingness of other parties to commit to long-term arrangements with you. Networks watch what 400,000 shares say about their talent decisions, because those shares represent the audience responding to the network's creative choices. An audience response to creative choices is the primary data source for future creative decisions. If the audience's response to the comparison is negative enough, sustained enough, loud enough to affect the new cast member's early reception, that creates a variable in TLC's calculation that the network did not anticipate. The research community, by producing a document detailed enough to generate that response, has introduced an element of genuine unpredictability into a process that the network assumed it controlled. Other networks also watch. They watch what TLC does with its talent when the replacement conversation begins. They watch how the transition is handled, how quickly it moves, what the public response looks like, and a talent who exits a franchise transition with her audience intact, with the community that built its loyalty around her still engaged, still paying attention, still willing to invest in whatever comes next, is not a damaged asset. She is a proven audience relationship that the next platform gets to inherit at the precise moment her profile is most elevated by the public discussion around her exit. The real question, the one that this entire series has been building toward across 30 episodes, is what Darcey builds in the space that opens up on the other side of this. Because the framework that just showed her its limits is also, from a certain angle, the framework that was always constraining her. A decade inside a single franchise relationship, however commercially successful, is also a decade of not building independently, not developing content verticals that belong entirely to her, not building the audience relationship on a platform she controls rather than one that belongs to a network whose priorities she cannot influence. The talent who emerges from a franchise replacement moment with the clearest thinking about what to build next, who uses the elevated public profile created by the replacement controversy to establish an independent platform before the controversy cycle winds down, consistently outperforms in the long arc. The names who made the transition successfully all share one characteristic. They understood that the replacement wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment the story became entirely their own to write. Darcey has survived every point of no return the series has documented. She has converted difficulty into content, controversy into audience growth, personal crisis into the kind of authentic storytelling that builds the specific audience loyalty that no network can replicate with a brief and a new cast member. What she has not done yet, what this moment is forcing her to confront, whether she is ready to or not, is build the thing that exists outside the framework that is currently being withdrawn from her. That thing, whatever form it takes, whatever platform it lives on, whatever version of Darcey Silva assembles it in the months following a replacement announcement that is still technically unofficial but culturally undeniable, is the most important content she will ever produce. Not most important to TLC's ratings, most important to her. Most important to the audience that has been following her long enough to have seen every version of the story and is still here because the story is genuinely interesting and the person at the center of it is genuinely compelling in a way that no production brief can fully capture or replicate. The 400,000 shares are not the end. They are the inciting incident of what comes next. And what comes next? The choices, the pivots, the content that gets made outside the room where the replacement decision was made is the chapter that nobody in TLC's production meetings planned for. Because you cannot plan for what someone builds when the constraint that was always limiting them is finally and forcibly removed. Subscribe, because this series documents all of it. Every episode, every development, every point of no return, and every comeback that follows. The Tell All Tapes exists because this story, Darcey's story, the franchise's story, the industry story about what it does to the people it makes famous deserves to be told by someone who will not look away from the complicated parts. You are here because you are the audience that wants the complicated parts. And that audience, your presence, your attention, your 400,000 shares of the documents that matter is exactly why the next chapter of this story is going to be the most important one yet.